secondly, I'm going to explain what allogeneic transplantation is and how it cures patients. And then finally, the last discussion point will be about the need for coverage for transplant to improve access for patients in need. So transplantation, it offers a curative potential for patients. It does cure patients with sickle cell disease. I hope that you'll take that message home today, but we still have much more work to be done. You might think about patients undergoing transplantation for leukemia or lymphoma, blood cancers, but it also cures non-cancerous diseases. In fact, the first transplant for sickle cell disease was in 1984. So it's something that we've been looking at for quite a while. So what is the National Marrow Donor Program, Be the Match? We started in the mid-1980s as a federally authorized program to improve access for transplant to patients in need, and established a national registry of volunteer donors who could provide stem cells for patients in need of a life-saving transplant. So we help match up donors, whether or not that's a related donor or an unrelated donor, for patients who need an allogeneic transplant. So the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about what an allogeneic transplant is. So allogeneic simply means that we're using cells from someone else, not the patient. And historically, that was always a person donor. And the ideal person is really an HLA-matched sibling. HLA stands for human leukocyte antigen. It's simply proteins on the cell surface that you inherit from your mom and dad. And we like to find the sibling that inherited those same proteins as the patient. And each sibling has a 1 out of 4 chance. So that means a 3 out of 4 chance, right, that a sibling won't match it. And so that's where the National Marrow Donor Program, Be the Match, was established to help identify unrelated donors. Now originally when transplantation started, you've heard the word BMT, bone marrow transplant, right? Well, that means taking the cells that you need for a transplant out of the bone marrow, out of the inside of your bones. And the easiest way to get those cells out is from the pelvis, from the back. And that's done usually in the operating room under general anesthesia. But an advance has been made in transplantation, and we figured out how to get those stem cells to come out of the bone marrow into the bloodstream. And that's like donating blood. And that's called peripheral blood stem cell transplant. So you may hear the phrase PBSC. It's really a way of where you get the stem cells from for the transplant. And then advances were made in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that we identified a way to get stem cells out of umbilical cord blood. So when parents donate umbilical cord blood at the time of their baby's birth. And so now, in this day and age, with every patient who needs an allogeneic transplant can find a donor. And the Be the Match facilitates that. Well, what about the patient? I think we're identifying a donor. On the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what the patient is undergoing. So this is kind of the usual transplant course. If you start on the left-hand side before the transplant, the patient needs to undergo some therapy to help their body get ready to accept a stranger's cells, right? Well, these are cells to suppress the immune system, so the new cells will grow and not be rejected. And then on day 0, that's when the new cells are infused. It's kind of like a blood transfusion. They're brought to the bedside and infused into a vein. And they magically know to go back to the bone marrow spaces and start growing and make healthy bone marrow. And in sickle cell disease, that includes making healthy red blood cells, right? Getting rid of sickle cell disease. As those cells grow, the patient feels better, gradually recovers, and is discharged from the hospital. Well, this sounds pretty easy, right? Then why aren't we doing this all the time? Sounds good. Well, there's always some risk associated as well as benefits. The major risk to transplantations, I told you those new cells, they have to grow inside the body, but they're smart. We have smart cells, and they can figure out that that patient is a stranger. And this is an immune disease called graft versus host disease. So the new cells are the graft, and the patient is the host. And those new cells can kind of attack the body, and they can cause various symptoms. Many times can be treated, but rarely the patient will have symptoms for many years. And so that has to be carefully weighed when we're thinking about transplantation, of curing a patient, versus the possibility of them having a complication. And most patients are in the hospital for several weeks. Okay, on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about Be the Match. So again, we were federally authorized in the 1980s and have been renewed ever since then. We started out here in the United States, but over time, we have now become a worldwide organization. So we can help find donors throughout the world. We do this with almost 50 donor centers, collection centers for bone marrow, apheresis centers for peripheral blood. We work with 174 transplant centers, 20 laboratories for all the blood testing that needs to be done. We have 44 recruitment centers to help recruit donors. In fact, today we're turning Rayburn Cafeteria into a recruitment center. And until 2:30, you can go have your mouth swabbed to join the registry. We work with cooperative registries throughout the world and 26 cord blood banks, so that we have access to almost 29 million donors and 700,000 cord blood units throughout the world. On the next slide, I'll tell you that I told you that the first transplant for sickle cell disease was done in 1984. Since that time, increasing numbers have been performed. The slide shows you from 2011 up to 2015, the growth from approximately 90 transplants up to 140, and we don't have all the numbers in for 2016 yet. So why isn't that greater? Again, it's a concept of thinking about risk and benefit, and whether or not a donor transplant is at the right time. When is the optimal time for a patient to undergo transplant? So the next slide, I'll tell you about some encouraging results, but more clinical trials are ongoing. For sibling transplants, if you will click again, Natasha, the survival is really good. Survival at 1 year is over 90%, and the amount of complications that we've seen has been pretty darn low. And so we think that is really a reasonable, really good option for those patients that have severe sickle cell disease. But I told you earlier that only 1 out of 4 siblings will be a match. And some of those siblings with sickle cell disease are also unfortunately have the disease and can't serve as a donor. So that only 18% of patients, only 18, that means 92% of patients won't have a suitable sibling. And that's where unrelated donor transplants are being studied in clinical trials. It's not working quite as well as with siblings. It's good, but we've got some work to do. The survival at 1 year is about 86%. Well, we've seen graft versus host disease, that immune reaction be higher. And so we're going back to the drawing board, and there are additional clinical trials ongoing, are being planned in an effort to improve the survival or reduce complications. And I think it's really important to note that trials are supported in part by the National Institute of Health. So without that type of research support, we wouldn't be able to do this work to move the field forward. So I'm going to close with a couple of points on the next slide regarding how we need to improve access to transplantation for our patients in need. So 2 items here. The first is removing the coverage barrier. And we've been successful with this. In June of 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid approved clinical trials with what is known as Coverage for Evidence Development, or CED. And this means that Medicare will provide coverage for beneficiaries who are eligible because of disability from sickle cell disease. And this may also improve access to Medicaid coverage, as Medicaid often will follow on a state-by-state basis the Medicare guidelines. Clinical trials are ongoing now for Medicare patients who are ages 15 to 40 years of age, with very clear eligibility criteria for whether or not they can be enrolled on the trial, with some of the complications of transplant that Dr. Thompson talked about. One of the big take-homes today that I would like you to be aware of is that we're really happy about the Medicare coverage for evidence development support. On the other hand, the payment remains a problem, the barrier for accessing transplant. And what do we mean by that? The 2017 base payment is $69,844. That's for an allogeneic transplant. That's a bundled payment to identify a donor. I just talked about trying to find a sibling. If that's not the case, finding an unrelated donor from around the world, collecting the cells, processing them, transporting them to the bedside, And the average cost of doing all of that is about $57,000. That leaves about $12,000 to cover the entire hospital stay and the rest of the patient's care. And I'm not a mathematician, but I can figure out that that doesn't quite leave enough money. And in some cases, it costs almost the whole cost of just getting the donor and getting the cells. So we have worked very closely with CMS, and they're incredibly supportive about this, but feel that it's outside of their scope, and that we really need congressional help in improving and removing a barrier. So we are seeking to introduce legislation in which CMS would be required to pay the cell acquisition cost while identifying the donor, getting the cells to the bedside. That would be separate from the hospital rates, so that we can really reimburse providers for the cost of providing a curative transplant. And this is very similar to that for solid organs. So for a kidney transplant, there are separate payments, one for identifying the donor, acquiring the organ, the other for care of the patient. So in the final slide, I have 3 take-home points. I hope that I've impressed upon you that allogeneic transplantation using donor cells is curative for patients with sickle cell disease, but we still have some work to do, particularly in the unrelated donor setting, to improve survival, but at the same time reduce complications. And Be the Match is working closely with CMS and Congress to improve access for patients and to appropriately reimburse for transplantation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. I'm just going to take a brief break in our program. I see that Congressman Dave Davis has joined us, and he's one of the co-founders of the Sickle Cell Disease Congressional Caucus, and I hope we'll share a few words with him.
All right, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and it's so good to see so many of you. Actually, I've been involved with sickle cell activity now for about 40 years. I used to work at a community health center, 2 of them, the Martin Luther King Center in Chicago and the Miles Square Center in Chicago. And I used to be president of something called the National Association of Community Health Centers. And I was a member of the American Public Health Association and the National Medical Association. So I've been around sickle cell for a long time. As a matter of fact, Dr. Bowman, who was Valerie Garrett's father, he's no longer alive, but he also was a big sickle cell guy. He had 2 grants, 5-year grants, that he got at the University of Chicago back in the 1970s, I guess. But let me just say that when I say it's so good to see so many of you, it really is. And I mean that sincerely. Because sickle cell has not been getting the kind of attention that I think it needs to have. I mean, we know that there are not as many people affected with sickle cell as there might be with heart disease, stroke, lots of other issues. But over 100,000 people consistently, and we hope to keep getting that reduced. So the work that we do, the research is vitally important. The education is absolutely important. And we're very excited because today there is a markup of my bill, H.R. 2410, Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act of 2017 on the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And this bill will reauthorize the original sickle cell legislation that we were fortunate to get passed into law in 2004. And the fact that it continues to be reauthorized and we continue to have resources. It's already passed out of subcommittee on a voice vote, which really means that everybody basically is supporting it. And we expect it to pass out of energy and commerce, and then go to the floor and be passed again. So We thank all of those who've been involved with it, who've been promoting it and pushing it. And I'm delighted that we have this joint activity taking place today. I see my good friend from Illinois who's heavily involved in research, Dr. Foster. And it's delighted to be here to be with him and all of you. Thank you very much.
I'll be brief. My apologies for being late. I was taken away from luncheon with a longtime ambassador dealing with the problems of North Korea, trying to prevent a nuclear war there. And so we deal with problems, trying to make humanity's lot a little bit better, or at least not get worse in so many ways. That's sort of what this meeting's about as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Congressman Bill Foster. I represent the Illinois 11th Congressional District. I'm the co-chair of one of the caucuses here that's sponsoring it. I also represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the United States Congress. I'm actually the only PhD scientist, physical scientist of any kind in either the House or Senate. But this is one of the reasons you get on an airplane to go to DC every week is to really to do two things: is to steer the money where you can to help the most people. Ultimately, that's what matters. That's the markup that Danny was talking about, is trying to get that to happen, and also to preserve the health of the pipeline. The reason that you have the word cure is on there, or curative actually, is that there have been decades and decades of federally funded research to understand what's going on genetically with sickle cell, what's going on in all of the complex response of our bodies to them, and to understand how you flip the switch to cure people. And because of that understanding, we're now within sight of cures for sickle cell in a number of paths, and that's what we'll be talking about today. I've met people who've been cured, and it's things like that really remind you, why you're going around wearing this silly badge. And it just, this is the end game, I guess. And so, pay attention, and as you think about all the beautiful technology that will be described here, think of the pyramid of federally funded research on which that has relied, that will eventually be used. And the moment we get a cure that can be deployed, where we know the cost, we know it's safe, there'll be members like Danny, like me, that will make sure that we get the huge pulse of effort to get that cure deployed to whether it's 90 or 100,000 sickle cell sufferers in the United States and also around the world, because that's our second big responsibility. At the point that the science is finished, the clinical trials are completed, we have to just go pedal to the metal on this, because it is a crime against humanity to do anything less. Anyway, well, thank you all. My apologies, I'm not going to be able to sit and listen to all of the science that I love in this, but thank you all for it. It's a pretty impressive journal.
So, Congressman spoke about how meeting patients can really drive the point home about the success of research and the importance of federal funding for the work that we do. So it's really my pleasure today to introduce Congressman Benson. Congressman was born with sickle cell disease, yet she pursued her dream of being a professional model until 2010, when the travel demands proved really too much for her body. And soon thereafter, sickle cell disease really began to bother her, and her disease quickly worsened. So on October 30th, 2012, Constance underwent an allogeneic transplant with bone marrow donated by her sister Samantha. She was treated on a clinical trial sponsored by Emory University in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And since her transplant, Constance has obtained her bachelor's degree in communications. She's getting a career in acting, currently working as a realtor in Georgia, pursuing a master's degree in business. So Constance, we're really looking forward to hearing your journey today.
she sounded. I was like, oh my God, I did that. No one unpacked. Well, as the lovely Dr. Burns said, I was born with sickle cell anemia, and I am the first person cured of sickle cell anemia via the STRIDE HCT bone marrow transplant, and that was funded by the NIH. Yeah. Okay, please keep me on track with time, because I can talk, all right? So just let me know. Oh, and ask questions at the end. I'll be more than happy to. I'm not too personal. All right. Now, I was born with sickle cell anemia, and I was born in Savannah, Georgia. Both my parents had the trait, but neither one of them knew the other one had the trait. And when I was tested, they tested me like at birth, and initially the results came back and said that I didn't have sickle cell. But then my mother was mailed the results, and a couple weeks later she found out that I did. So that was fun, finding that out of the mailbox. Anyway, so I've always known that I've had sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease, and I have never let it define me. And okay, let me tell you all the stories. Okay, so we lived in Savannah, Georgia for a while, but then my grandmother got sick. She had cancer, and so we moved back to South Carolina. It was in South Carolina where I started to realize that I wasn't like all the other kids. Okay, it was field day. There's this girl named Felicia. Felicia could run. I wanted to beat Felicia because every year she got that blue ribbon, and I wanted that blue ribbon that said #1 on it, okay? So we were at field day one summer, and I was like, okay, I got this. I can do this. I can do this. They hit the thing, and then we start going, and then about halfway, I'm like, oh, God, my back. And then I see Felicia running, and then running back, and I got last place. But I was in so much pain, and it was in that moment that I realized that I'm not like Felicia. I'm not like all the other kids where she ran and going, not breaking a sweat, and me, I'm like the pain is just going up my back, and I remember that day vividly and realizing that, okay, I might be a little different. But different doesn't mean anything. Different means that I am special, so I'm going to rock with that. So me and my family, both of my parents are nurses. And what we did was we educated ourselves. We did a whole bunch of preventative measures. We did a lot of hydration. But with sickle cell, if you don't cure it, all you can do is manage it, manage the symptoms, manage the pain. So I was on hydrocodone, oxycodone, all that other stuff at a very young age, and all the way up into adulthood. We left South Carolina and we moved to Georgia, and we were able to manage my pain. It wasn't too bad. I knew what I had, but I didn't let it define me. Then puberty hit, and that was awesome. Yeah, and so my disease, the pain increased. It got worse, but it was still manageable. And I did as much as I could as my peers, but I couldn't do things like get into a pool without being in pain or potentially going to the hospital. It wasn't until I was 18 I could get in the pool and get out. And I had to do hydration, my oxycodone, my hydrocodone. I knew I couldn't go anywhere for the rest of that day or maybe the next 2-3 days. But I was going to live. Anyway, so I decided, I was like, you know what? I graduated high school. I was like, everything is going together health-wise. I'm good. So I decided I was going to go to college, right? I decided to, after 2 other colleges, I decided to go to Georgia State University. Now, I don't know if y'all been to Georgia State University, but if not, you missed out on something because the parties were awesome. There were so many schools everywhere. I had fun. So I lived in the dorm rooms, and then I moved out and I had my apartment, and everything was going. It was going. My disease started getting worse, and it was harder to make it to my classes on time. the disability office at my school knew that I had sickle cell, but they didn't really know sickle cell. The information is so outdated, they really didn't know. And then I had a professor who, I had straight A's, but my professor didn't understand my disease and didn't understand that I look normal, but I'm actually in pain. I could be talking to you, having a conversation like this and be in so much pain, but when you have sickle cell, you are a fighter. You don't have that choice to sit here and cry and whine. You gotta fight. So, that one class, my teacher told me I was like one day away from him giving me a failing grade because of the attendance. Anyway, so after I finished that semester, I decided to just take a little break and really figure out what was going on with my disease. And when I did, okay, I sent, it was Halloween weekend. I sent an email. I saw that Wilhelmina and Kasha Hawken, they were having open call. And I was like, okay, it's my dream, I want to model, you know. I was like, I think I look like it. So I was like, I think I got this, right? So I sent the email. I had this. I'm sorry about my English. Anyways, I sent the email, and they wanted me to come to Philly, and it was snowing like December, and that was sickle cell. Let me tell you something. It was kicking my butt, but I tried to look flawless like Beyonce, okay? So I was like, all right. I rode a Greyhound first time, got there, and I landed it. I received a modeling contract with Wilhelmina and Kasha Hawken, but I lived 13 hours away. So I got a lot of miles on my Kia. Well, my mama Kia now. I would drive 13 hours from Kennesaw, Georgia to Woolwich Township, New Jersey, then go from, my grandma stayed in Jersey and it was free. So then go from Jersey to Philly and Kasha Hawken, model and all that stuff. I never told them I had sickle cell because one, I didn't want them to say I couldn't do my job, and two, I was like, nothing's going to stop me. You are going to hire me, okay? No threats though. So what I did was I went to Kasha Hawken. I would come back to New Jersey, and then I drive all the way back to Georgia, 13 hours, and I would be in pain. I'd either go right into the hospital, they admitted right into the hospital. I'd go to my doctor's office to get pain therapy, which is Toradol. I already had the fentanyl patch, 150 micrograms, Toradol, oxycodone, 30 milligrams, Benadryl. There's a couple other drugs that I had, but this is all just pain management because all you can do is manage the pain if you're not curing sickle cell. And contrary to what a lot of people believe, it gets worse until you can manage it for yourself and figure out your body and how it works. Anyways, so every single trip, I was going into the hospital, and my parents were looking at me like I was all kinds of psycho, but I was like, I am going to do this. Nothing is going to tell me I can't do this. No one, nothing. After a year of doing this, I think it was about 15 trips, my body just couldn't take it anymore, and it felt like the life was taken out of me. I went from being able to go places, do things. I know it wasn't all the way normal, but it was manageable. I woke up every single day in pain, and then I couldn't pursue my dream. As a matter of fact, I was in the hospital when I got the call. They were like, "Hey, this is in New York. There's a Wiz Khalifa audition for the video." I was like, "I'm not gonna dance because I don't do that." But they were like, "Come on, we have this audition for you. You need to be in New York tomorrow." I was hooked up with an IV. I had Dilaudid and a 150 microgram fentanyl patch. I was in a full-blown sickle cell crisis, getting IV fluids, and it was just bad. I told them to disconnect me. My family fought me on it, and I didn't make it 5 feet from my bed. It was so bad. And I still remember that, and it hurt so bad because I had to crawl back in bed. They had to hook me back up. I was in more pain than if I had just kept it going, and I had to call my agency and tell them that I couldn't do my job. I had sickle cell. Things were going bad, and I just couldn't do it. And so from there, it was like waking up every single day in pain And it was new. I'd never had that before. And it was like you're looking to your mom and your daddy. They can't do nothing for you. They can't take it for you. All you can do is just manage pain. So through all of this, we found out about a bone marrow transplant. And my mom, being a nurse, she's a traveling nurse, and she had a patient one day come up, and the mother was so frantic. She's like, oh my God. She was running late. She's like, oh my God, I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss you. Whatever. And my mom was like, no, take your time. It was nothing but God. It's like, take your time. I will be there. Bring your son. Don't rush or whatever. He was the patient. I'll be there. My mother waited, and after they got there and were setting everything up, she was talking, found out that the son was a transplant patient. Kind of find out it was a bone marrow transplant, and he was cured of sickle cell. So from there, my mom was like, okay, I want all the information. She wrote all the doctors down and everything, and got all the information. She started calling people, and we were like, okay, they're doing it for children. What about adults? And they were working on it, but it was a lot of back and forth political stuff that I'm sure you guys know about. I'm good. Teach me later, okay? So my mother was put in touch with the right people, and my doctor, we came across him, Dr. Edmund Waller at Emory Winship Cancer Institute. He was my bone marrow transplant doctor. When all this stuff was going down, they were doing the paperwork, going back and forth, trying to figure out how to get everything going. And after all that happened and things getting worse, frequent hospitals, I was in hospital a whole lot more times. And we get to where it's like, okay, well, you can have a transplant. My sister, who's right here in the black and white, this outgoing person, she was 100% match, 10 out of 10. And it was awesome. She decided at 9 years old that she was going to cure me of sickle cell. Me at 25 was like, oh girl, no, you don't have to. I'm good. I got it, a soldier. Woo! I'm so glad that they ignored me and that she was bribed with a puppy and that she got me. Chloe is my dog. But I got the bone marrow transplant. It was actually very, very easy to receive that. That was like an IV. The hardest part was the chemo. Now, if y'all can give us a funding to figure that out, that'd be great, because I lost all my hair and my eyebrows. I looked like a freaky alien for a long time, and I got skinny too, but I put it on in the right places with J-Lo booty. So I was cured of sickle cell via the Stride ACT bone marrow transplant study, which was funded by the NIH. And I worked, my sister was in Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and I was in Emory, and it was so wonderful how it happened, because my life is night and day. I went from dying, having to figure out if I'd make it to C30, which I will this Saturday. I went from dying to now I get to rewrite my life and actually have a life that is so amazing. I can get in the pool, water, whatever, and I don't have to take not one pain pill, not anything. I get to live. And I can't tell you how much that you work here, all of you guys, because people behind the scenes against the movement, but behind and in front of the camera. Matter of fact, all y'all. Anyway, I can't tell you how important your job is and how much you really impact people's lives. I know that without the NIH, without Emory, without Children's, I wouldn't be here because it wouldn't be available. And I'm just putting a face to a name. I want to be one of many, and I want sickle cell to be cured so that all of us can go skydiving, because that's on my bucket list, well, not bucket list, I'm not dying, but 30. So, skydiving, come on, y'all. All right, I'm sorry, bye, y'all.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this was truly a hard act to follow, Dr. Bauer. But I'm going to nonetheless try to introduce Dr. Dan Bauer, who is a physician scientist whose research utilizes something called genome editing, which I'm sure he will explain to you in great detail to understand the causes of blood disorders and to look for potential innovative therapeutic strategy. His work is in pediatric hematology, so he focuses on the care of children with hemoglobin disorders. He's currently an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and is a staff physician and principal investigator at the Dana-Farber Boston Children's Cancer and Blood Disorder, and the recipient, not surprising, and once you hear his, of many awards recognizing his contributions to the field. Dr. Bauer?
Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Constance, for your inspiring story and courage. So I'm going to tell you about genome editing for sickle cell disease, and next slide, here's my disclosures. So Dr. Burns and Constance have already introduced that we already have curative approaches for sickle cell disease, that is bone marrow transplant. And here we take the blood-forming cells from a healthy donor and transplant them to a patient. But there's major challenges to the widespread implementation of this therapy, and that includes a limited donor pool, some immune incompatibilities between the donor cells and the patient cells, and morbidity and mortality. So an alternative approach would be to collect the blood-forming cells from the patient, him or herself, to modify those cells, and then to reinfuse them. So I'm going to, in the next slide, give you a very brief refresher of human genetics, where the cell is the basic subunit of the human body, and within the cell is the nucleus, which contains what we call the genome, which has the full set of instructions for making a cell, a tissue, or an organ, or even the human body. And this genome is divided into chromosomes, which contain genes, and the genetic material is composed of the chemical DNA. And on the next slide, you'll see that the precise sequence of DNA contains more than 3 billion individual nucleotides, which carry the information of the genome. So if you think about a typical book has 500,000 letters in it, a genome is like 6,000 books. And genome editing is like a word processor where you could find a single typo in one word in one of those 6,000 books and erase a few misspelled letters. So here's an artistic depiction of genome editing, and the idea is you use molecular tools to erase specific sequences within the genome. And so one opportunity for genome editing would be to perform kind of a molecular surgery, where instead of using a scalpel to remove diseased tissue from the body, the therapy would actually be to use these molecular scissors to cut out disease-associated DNA sequences. So genome editing takes advantage of tools that are called DNA targeting nucleases. And these tools have two features. So the first is they can recognize very specific DNA sequences. And this is depicted here as this orange rectangle. And this targeting part is like using a molecular zip code, which can find just the right location within the genome. And then the package that gets delivered is the nuclease, shown here as a red circle. And after being delivered to just the right spot in the genome, the nuclease cuts the DNA. And on the next, these genome editing tools, they weren't built from scratch, actually. In fact, they use a naturally occurring components of an immune system that bacteria have to fight viruses. And so genome editing is just one of many examples where the federal investment in fundamental research, in this case the mechanisms that bacteria use to protect themselves from viruses, pay unexpected dividends. In this case, enabling tools that can cause specific changes in the human genome. And this is another artistic depiction of genome editing. So the nuclease is this kind of blob in the middle, and it scans the genome for sequences shown as these yellow spots. And then with the guidance of the DNA targeting molecule shown in red, it's delivered to just the right spot in the genome. And when it arrives, it produces a double strand break where these two molecular pinches cut the DNA. And so next, after the DNA is broken, it's actually natural mechanisms in cells that determine the outcomes. And the cell has two main ways to repair broken DNA. The first is on the left is kind of a delete mode where the two ends are pasted back together, but a few sequences at the junction are removed. The second on the right is a copy and paste mode, in which case a template is used to make precise changes to the genome. And so next, you might think that the copy and paste mode is very appealing in that a healthy copy of the gene could be used to swap in for the disease copy. And this could, for example, directly fix the sickle cell mutation. However, it turns out with current technology, the delete mode is actually much more efficient. So if there were sequences that we could just delete in sickle cell disease that would lead to a beneficial outcome, it would be much easier to develop a therapeutic genome editing strategy. And it turns out there are these target sequences. These are the sequences that turn off the expression of fetal hemoglobin. So fetal hemoglobin is an alternative form of hemoglobin that also can carry oxygen, but it prevents sickling. And patients with sickle cell disease who have the highest quartile of fetal hemoglobin have substantially longer survival than those patients with lower fetal hemoglobin. On the next slide, you'll see, in fact, that the red blood cells of all newborns with sickle cell disease are protected from sickling due to the high level of fetal hemoglobin. But only after birth, fetal hemoglobin gets turned off, and that's when sickle cell disease begins to clinically manifest. And so sickle cell disease doesn't cause problems in fetuses or young infants, but only starts to cause problems around age 6 months. So the next slide. Major advances in our understanding of the control of fetal hemoglobin and how it's turned off naturally have come from genetic studies. So genome-wide association studies are large studies where individuals with and without a condition are compared to identify specific DNA differences associated with that condition. And these powerful studies have only been possible due to the federal investment in the Human Genome Project. So on the next slide, this is the kind of data one gets from one of these genome-wide association studies. This is called the Manhattan plot. And on the y-axis are all the differences between people in their DNA. And on the y-axis are the statistically significant spots. And you can see these stripes that rise up from the horizon that show spots in the DNA sequence that are associated with a given condition. So it's called the Manhattan plot because it looked to someone like skyscrapers on the horizon of New York. So when the genome-wide, go back one, genome-wide association studies were done for fetal hemoglobin, the results were very striking. And just a few of these skyscrapers were found, and this one shown on the left, I'm going to highlight, called BCL11A, and genetic differences at this spot were associated not only with the level of fetal hemoglobin, but also with the severity of sickle cell disease. So people who had differences at this spot actually had milder sickle cell disease. And on the next, we kind of thought of this as like the Empire State Building on the horizon of the Manhattan plot of fetal hemoglobin. And on the next, you can see one experiment that kind of demonstrates the importance of BCL11A in sickle cell disease. So a mouse that carried sickle cell disease was mated with a mouse that lacked BCL11A to create a mouse that both had sickle cell disease but lacked BCL11A. And you can see normally the sickle cell disease mouse would have these sickle cells shown by the arrows in their blood. But when BCL11A was gone, the sickle cells disappeared. And this was because the fetal hemoglobin, which was very low in the regular sickle cell disease condition, became very high when BCL11A was gone. So on the next slide, this kind of supports our therapeutic vision, which is we could use genome editing in the delete mode to delete sequences of BCL11A and get rid of this repressor of fetal hemoglobin in red cells to turn back on fetal hemoglobin at the expense of sickle hemoglobin. So this is just one of a number of plausible visions for curing sickle cell disease. I've listed a number here. One can consider them based on what are the source of cells used to form blood. They could be from a donor, either a matched sibling donor like Constance, or from an alternative donor, and there's ongoing research into identifying improved ways to use alternative donors. Could be from the patient, him or herself, and there's a variety of ways one could modify the patient's cells. One could use something called gene therapy to add a healthy version of hemoglobin, and there's been some very recent studies that are quite exciting in this area. There's also a variety of ways one could turn back on this alternative form of hemoglobin called fetal hemoglobin, either using gene therapy or using genome editing. And then finally, one could use genome editing to precisely repair the sickle cell disease mutation. So what are the prospects for actually getting this into the clinic? What do we have to accomplish? We have to edit many cells. What's a clinical scale? It turns out to be hundreds of millions of cells, so it has to be a very robust process. Next. The tools we use really have to make the changes we want them to make and not other changes in the genome, so they have to be very specific. Next, we need to get the cells. So in sickle cell disease, some of the ways that we're able to get the cells that Dr. Burns discussed need to be further investigated, and they may not be the off-the-shelf ways that we've used for other conditions. The cells, once we have obtained them and modified them, need to get back in and go to the right place. And are there safer ways to get them to the right place to avoid the kind of chemotherapy that the Constants had to face? We don't actually have to turn on we don't have to get rid of all the sickle hemoglobin and turn on 100% fetal hemoglobin. If we just got about 30% level of fetal hemoglobin, that would be more than enough to prevent sickling. And we don't need to modify every last blood-forming cell. If we had even 20% of the blood-forming cells modified, that would be more than enough to prevent sickle cell disease complications. So all of this is feasible with existing technology, but only will be achieved with ongoing research investment. And then there's visions for the future that I think are even more audacious, where one could produce an indefinite supply of patient blood-forming cells, or one could deliver, like a shot, directly to the body genome editing tools so that one wouldn't need to do all this complicated manufacture of cells outside the body. So I think of curative approaches of sickle cell disease. It's like the summit is climbing Mount Everest, and we have a number of possible paths that we could use to reach the summit. These include bone marrow transplant, they include gene therapy, they include gene editing, and it's not clear in 2017 which is going to be the best path, and we really need to explore them all to find the best ways to safely, effectively cure sickle cell disease that can get to the most patients as possible. So finally, sickle cell disease can be cured in a number of ways, using donor blood-forming cells or by modifying patients' blood-forming cells. Genome editing is an exciting new technology where we can allow precise and permanent modification of sequences to either turn on fetal hemoglobin or repair the sickle mutation. The progress in this area has really been enabled by fundamental basic science discoveries, and these are only made due to federally funded research. And the curative therapies for sickle cell disease have never been closer, but we need more research to reach the summit. So thanks to many colleagues and collaborators and inspiring patients, and to the NIH for funding these efforts.
Thank you. So I hope what you've heard are three very inspiring presentations. And so we do have some time for questions for any of our panelists. Yes?
Yeah, Mr. Bauer, have you guys been looking into using CRISPR-Cas at all when you guys do this?
Yes. So I didn't use the term CRISPR-Cas just to not make things too jargony, but some of the slides I showed on the targeted nucleases are especially referring to CRISPR-Cas, and that raw picture was actually Cas9 with a CRISPR guide. So I think that's a very exciting set of tools for genome editing. And really that one came from microbiologists studying how the bacteria that make yogurt, why they're healthy or why they're sick. And so studies of the yogurt bacteria have led to advances that may be curative for sickle cell disease and many other diseases. And so I think it just emphasizes how important the federal funded research initiative is.
Yes.
So the question was, could I expand on the funding for Medicare? So Medicare offers beneficiaries who are disabled with sickle cell disease coverage for transplantation at the age of 15 and 40. They have to produce sickle cell disease.
Medicaid will follow that.
It's that one bundle payment, right? And so the point about the second issue is that it doesn't cover all of the costs because of the way that the bundling is done. And they're supportive of us and the legislation that we hope will be introduced by the end of June, and we're looking for co-sponsors for that to help for reimbursement. But CMS has been a really good partner for us, and they're interested in continuing to help patients with sickle cell disease. Thank you.
I know the story.
Yeah.
Representative Walker working on HCR 36, which helps foster awareness of sickle cells. One of the things that she's concerned about is how will hospitals are telling parents about people that their child, what's the likelihood of them passing on sickle cells, what they can do, create a plan with, I guess, they can start saving up money. And so,
Yeah, so I can comment about that. The question was, how can word get out? You heard about us as a story. How do patients understand this? I'll just comment on Be the Match, who has a patient educational services department that really works hard to give information out for patients and families, but also ASH. And would you like to comment about the Sickle Cell Coalition?
Happy to. So, and I'm also a pediatric hematologist, and so this is kind of what I do every day. This is really our life's work that, that we begin with. We're fortunate in the United States that by and large, all children with sickle cell disease that are born in the United States should be diagnosed at birth. There certainly are many ways that children currently get access to care, but we still realize that there are gaps. So the American Society of Hematology, and part of the Sickle Cell Disease Coalition, is really trying to unify, to amplify, and to solidify the things that we are pursuing. Access to care certainly is one of those things. Enhancing research in sickle cell disease is certainly a very important part. And the third one is global. And so some of these things are being pursued by ASH. Some of them are things that we're looking for support from the entire coalition. We think that there are opportunities for many different agencies, many different entities to be involved. People that are involved with patient advocacy groups, foundations, federal partners, as well as the pharmaceutical industry, frankly, can be involved in ways to not only look at managing sickle cell disease, but also really looking at and continuing to pursue our opportunities for cure.
Okay, one more time. Can you repeat your question?
my question is there efforts to increase education on sickle cells, work on future with sickle cells?
Okay, one of the biggest reasons why I am here is to help put sickle cell on the map. Because to be honest about it, I've been in a sickle cell crisis many a times, and I have to educate the person who is taking care of me, or the person, I have to get through the admissions officer to do it. Like I'm not sure if I said this story or not to you guys. When I was at the hospital this one time, I'm sitting here in a full-blown sickle cell crisis, and the lady is talking to me about, you're too pretty to have sickle cell. Oh, you're too pretty to be sick. That was what she said. And then, on top of that, I'm like, okay, no, I'm sick. She tells me about her party weekend. The truth is that people, yeah, I was like, for real, you caught me on an off day, honey. But the truth is, people really do not understand sickle cell disease, and I want them, my goal is to make it so that everybody knows sickle cell. I remember being in school, and they had this huge page on diabetes. It was I'm not going to tell the year, but it was a couple years ago, okay? But they had a huge page on diabetes, and this girl came in, she had her insulin, it was so cute, she was showing them how she do it. I was like, oh my God, that's so cute. And then we had like one paragraph for sickle cell, and then she was like, yeah, I know about that, it's right here. I was like, you mean your little outdated information on sickle cell? Okay. Truth is, that same logic with the textbook, it kind of goes out with a lot of people. These people, they're smart like a mother. I mean, they're really smart. Yes. And we need their education to rub off on others. People need to be educated about sickle cell, because there are so many people who go into the hospital and people are looking at them like they looked at me. They're either you're drug seeking because you know what you need to get you to keep you alive, or they don't know your disease, you're too pretty to be sick. Is They need education, and if we could really make that happen, make it to where they have to know something about it, something more than what was in 1980s, know something. We've had like 10 iPhones, 7, 8, 9 iPhones. That's outdated, okay? Know something. Okay.
So also to answer your question about education, earlier Representative Davis talked about the bill that's being currently marked up. Within there is an education and awareness component that the CDC does, but as a coalition, we're also raising awareness through the Sickle Cell Disease Coalition.org. Additionally, Ash is doing a number of things, which I'll let Dr. Thompson talk about, educating other providers.
And when we say educating other providers, we're talking about a variety of different kind of providers, not just hematologists, but also primary care doctors, emergency medicine physicians, and hospitalists. There's another question here.
Yeah, I was curious if you all had any information about the average age of a transplant procedure is, and how much money is spent in kind of managing the symptoms that result from sickle cell disease.
The transplant part of the question.
Yeah, so the transplant part, the question was the average age for transplantation. And it has changed. We know that the key point is to try to go to transplantation when sickle cell disease is severe, because it does have some risk associated with it. So it really is a balance. And so it's really not the age, it really is the severity of symptoms. And as Constance can probably tell you, that it varies for individuals about how severe the disease is when it's manifesting itself. So it really is an overall view of that. But a care of a sickle cell disease patient, Constance just told you, she was in and out of the hospital for care. And so it's expensive. It's expensive.
I had Medicare. Yeah, I had Medicare. It got being able to be not only on my parents' insurance because I was disabled, but also having Medicare, that really took a lot of the financial burden off of them. Because there's nothing like, even when I was in the hospital, my parents, my mother, she was working. And then they had my sister who was in school. So they were juggling back and forth. And I can only imagine having even more, needing even more money on top of that just to take care of your child so your child won't die. The truth is, Medicare, it really helped me. It really helped me out. And it kept me from losing my sanity, because there's nothing like seeing your parents and seeing the stress on them. As a matter of fact, I didn't get to tell you guys a story. There's this girl named Etsy, I believe. She has sickle cell. She's in her 40s. And she's chronically ill, and they're working on research to cure people older too, but right now this is in kind of like the baby stages. And she had a hospitalization, and her hemoglobin was at a 4, and that's horrible. She was dying, and she was going to refuse the blood transfusion. She had my exact same hematologist. She was going to refuse that blood transfusion because she saw the stress that it was putting on her family, on her kids, and just the amount of money that it was costing her to even be in the hospital just to live. She was going to refuse it, but luckily we had Dr. Carmen Class. She's an awesome doctor, and she don't take any more patients with sickle cell because she's full to capacity, because everybody heard about her celebrity. And she's awesome. And she was just going to let herself die, because you see the stress that it's putting on them. You know that there is nothing you can do about it. Medicare really did help me with what it does, and it'd be great if they could do just a little bit more, something that caters to them to keep us from wanting to end it, because honestly waking up every single day in pain and then seeing it wear on your family over time, that gets to you. And there are times when you look at death as, you know what, it's not bad because it's just sleep. And I rest in sleep.
Thank you for sharing your story.
There's just also, in terms of these mating numbers, and you guys already know, so there are 100,000 people with sickle cell disease, about $1.1 billion in terms of healthcare cost each year. I think as a general statement, and I agree with Dr. Burns, the average number is not important in terms of the age, but that as a general rule, early transplants are better for almost any condition. The challenge is something that Dr. Bauer mentioned, and that is trying to understand what are those other genetic modifiers, who are going to be those people who are going to have more sickle cell disease, and can I learn that either from their DNA or from some other profile that will allow me to say this is a child who has a 5-year-old should be transplanted as a 5-year-old because as a 15-year-old, they're going to have a life-threatening complication. If we can actually begin to take what we're learning in the laboratory and to actually translate into that, how we actually choose patients for higher risk procedures, that is something that we think is also well within our means, and certainly that will in all likely be the way where we enhance transplants. Not necessarily transplants or gene therapy or gene editing for every patient, but really being able to predict with a fair amount of certainty that this is the right patient and this is the right time for that procedure. There was someone in the back?
No, you answered it.
He said it was.
Yeah, I had a question. It was related to, when you said you're in the hospital one time, the nurse or doctor was talking about partnership, and then she didn't know a lot about sickle cell, and you mentioned that, like, she thought people like maybe drug seeking, and with the opioid crisis that is occurring, especially in the Midwest. I'm from Illinois, and I have a cancer friend that has sickle cell, and sometimes she can't get the opioid meds that she needs because of their restrictions placed on the doctor.
Yeah, it's with sickle cell. If you're not curing sickle cell, you're treating the pain, treating the symptoms, and that medication, those opioids, that's our lifeline. That's what's keeping us breathing, keeping us going, because you don't realize how much pain you're in to get to the, because you kind of let it build. It's not that you're letting it build, you're trying to manage it on your own to keep from being in the hospital. Then by the time you get to the hospital, they give you their drugs, the heavy duty ones, and you realize you have a moment of clarity. You didn't realize how much pain you had been in until you feel pain-free for a couple hours. That medication is our lifeline. That is what basically keeps us going, keeps us alive, because I tell you, like, I'm not lying to you, sickle cell pain is horrible. I had my doctor tell me I took enough medication for a 400-pound man with brain cancer. And I had fentanyl, 150 micrograms of fentanyl, oxycodone had about 30 milligrams, I believe. The hydrocodone was like a Tic Tac, it didn't do anything. What else? I had Dilaudid, 2 milligrams of Dilaudid, those pills. I had a regimen that I had to follow, and whenever I missed something, if I missed that patch, I felt it, and I was in the hospital. Those medications really work.
Yeah, and my family friend sometimes she is not able to have the access to the medication she needs to relieve herself from that pain because of the restrictions placed on doctors. Because the opioid crisis, some people have argued that it's connected to prescription drugs.
So the point you were raising is really an important one, and I would say this is an area where multiple groups are working, hopefully, and the coalition will help with that. So for instance, that actually is a topic where hematologists, primary care physicians, and emergency medicine physicians are all working together. We recognize that sickle cell disease is certainly on that short list where I don't think there's any question that these are people who need access to these medications. It is balanced, though, against what I think most of us would consider a national epidemic. I think working together, we really are trying to make sure that we can restrict access in areas where there's clearly harm being caused, but yet making sure that patients who need these medications are getting it. I think your point's well taken. It is an ongoing process, but it is a very serious problem. But I think providers are committed to working together to understand who needs this, who needs to have access to it, but where can if we can apply some caution to make sure that we are not exposing vulnerable populations to the risk of addiction. There's one more question. That's going to be our last question for the afternoon.
Thank you all. So the handout lists hydroxyurea, which pharmacologically raise fetal hemoglobin levels. I would appreciate if someone could comment on the reasons for its under prescription and the approval in speaking of children.
Yeah, and for the last question, that is a humongous question. So I can certainly probably take that one. Hydroxyurea is the hydroxyurea we are hoping will be approved in children shortly. The application is already into the Food and Drug Administration, and there are a number of clinical trials, most of whom which are funded by the NIH, that have clearly demonstrated not only benefit but also safety in small children. I think the challenge is making sure that when we see new information that we have the ability to disseminate that. So the young man in front was asking about how do we get the word out. You know, many of us are very fortunate to work at academic medical centers where many times these breakthroughs come. Many of our patients are not cared for at academic medical centers. And so really trying to create the network, ASH, as well as many of the other members of the coalition, interface with people who are not necessarily in academic centers, but who are there at the forefront for patients. So we think there are opportunities to do a couple of things. One is to educate hematologists, to educate primary care physicians, and also to educate patients. So among the things, for instance, ASH is doing with some of its other partners is to create patient-facing materials. There are many materials that are in the medical literature that are accessible to providers. We want patients to have comparable kinds of materials that so if their primary care provider or their hematologist is not talking to them about things like hydroxyurea, that they can actually come well armed with their doctors to begin to advocate for themselves, and we think that that's absolutely possible. We really do hope that the indication for pediatrics will come soon. Frankly, though, I must tell you that in this day and age, it is very hard for me as a hematologist taking care of this disease to say that I only have one drug to talk about. That in and of itself is a challenge. We would never do that. There is not a single other major condition that we treat in the United States that has a single drug to attack a complex problem. And so not only do we need to think about increased utilization of hydroxyurea, we fundamentally need to support the pipeline that hopefully will give us more options for disease management and hopefully for cure.
Hydroxyurea didn't work. So I completely agree.
We need more.
Yes.
So we've gone over time, and I really appreciate everyone's attention. I can't thank our speakers enough for what's been a really good meeting.